morning, Mr. Poling. It's our pleasure to have you here in our program at home with GMA Regional TV.
I'm really honored to be here, Jandy. Thank you.
All right, let's straight to the point. Let's go to the topic, Mr. Poling. You have been studying the issue on Spratly Islands and dispute between China and other countries. Hence, you have published a book entitled On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea. So far, what were your findings and realizations on the disputed West Philippine Sea?
Well, the big takeaway, I wrote this book as an American for an American audience, but also as an American who's deeply invested in the US-Philippine alliance and has been working on the alliance for over a decade. And I wanted to dig down to what exactly are the fundamental interests of the United States and the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, and what have they been? And so going back over a century, what you see is that they've been very consistent, far more consistent than China's position has been. The U.S. And U.S. officials have talked about freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, the idea that there's rules and the rules matter, and we all have agreed on the rules. That's been the U.S. position for a century in the South China Sea.
All right. Being an external watcher over the years, probably you have studied all the foreign policies that have been established since the start of the dispute in Spratly Islands. But technically speaking, what do you think is lacking in the foreign policy that up until now, the dispute is still on and escalating?
One of the things that's really been problematic for everybody has been the changes in China's claims, particularly since the 1990s. For many, many decades, the South China Sea disputes were just about the islands. And so they were something to be managed between the parties. By the 1990s, suddenly China starts claiming these newfangled ideas of historic rights, and the 9-dash line becomes a much bigger deal. So it's not just that Beijing is claiming the land, the islands themselves, but suddenly it's claiming all the waters, all the seabed, all fishing and oil and gas rights. And the US and the Philippines and the other claimants were far too slow to recognize that change and respond to it. We still, I think, have trouble admitting to ourselves just how far-reaching China's claims. Right? China's not going to back down because the Philippines says so. It would only back down if it was treated the way that, say, a Russia is for its bad behavior. The biggest problem then is this coalition starting to form, but there's nobody to lead it. The Philippines has refused to talk about the arbitration case for 6 years. Vietnam's not doing it, and nobody else can do it for them.
All right. In your research or study of the region, how does the territorial dispute affect the relationships of the countries involved?
It was manageable for most of the 20th century. The Republic of Vietnam and the Philippines kind of played this game of checkers for the 1960s and 70s, and the Republic of China was involved in 56, but it was always something that could be managed. It was a tension, but everybody knew it wasn't going to upset all of their relationship. In the 1990s, suddenly with China entering the dispute, fighting the Vietnamese and taking over 7 islands in 1988, and then taking Mischief Reef in 1994, things fundamentally changed. And what you started to get from then is the South China Sea becoming a major driver for ASEAN unity.
Mm-hmm. All right. In spite of the historic 2016 decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which explicitly stated that China has no legal basis for claiming historic rights to the resources in the area, particularly in Spratly Islands. So China has refused to accept the court's decision, while 4 other countries are still claiming ownership of the disputed territories. What other steps should the Philippines take to reinforce ownership claims, Mr. Poling?
Well, there's 2 things that are needed. In the short term, the Philippines needs the AFP modernization program to continue. It needs to maintain the ability to patrol and access and resupply its own waters. Just last month, we saw China again prevent resupply of the Filipino Marines on the Sierra Madre. The Philippines needs to keep up modernization to make sure that China can't just take these things without a fight. We also need to find a way to modernize and update the alliance and the mechanisms of the U.S.-Philippine alliance so that the U.S. can help facilitate that. And the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is a major part of that, the agreement that we negotiated in 2014. But that's the short-term play. The long-term play has to be to impose diplomatic cost on Beijing by bringing up the arbitration award at every opportunity, including in the UN. One of the most missed opportunities has been the refusal to bring up the arbitral award before the UN General Assembly for votes. Those votes wouldn't be binding, but China would lose.
All right. Until now, China has never admitted its presence in the periphery of South China Sea. But in your book, you have recorded comparative photographs on the current status of the ecological system in the South China Sea from 2016 to present. Can you shed light about this matter?
So Beijing has been very cagey about the idea that it's actually paying for and sending most of the vessels down to the South China Sea that we see every single day. Now, we know from Chinese documents, and I walk through some of this in the book, that China's been subsidizing and paying fishing boats to go down to the Spratly Islands and Scarborough Shoal since at least 1985. None of those fishermen would operate if the government wasn't paying them to do it. Today, we see the same taking place with marine science. All of the Chinese survey vessels that operate in the Philippine EEZ are there because the Chinese government sends them there, pays them to be there. All of that is about normalizing Chinese presence, right? Making sure that there are Chinese boats of all kinds in the waters of the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia all the time.
Now, how will this affect the United States diplomatic and economic relationship with both China and the Philippines?
There's a lot at stake for the United States. On the one hand, we're at a pretty critical moment for the U.S.-Philippine alliance. And the alliance is the oldest U.S. alliance in Asia. The U.S.-Philippines NDT predates that with Australia by 3 days. It's the first we signed. And really today, it entirely rests on the credibility of the U.S. defense commitment in the South China Sea. The Philippines only faces one external threat. And if the U.S. can't help the Philippines secure its legal rights in the South China Sea, then the alliance will eventually go away because Filipinos will rightly recognize that the alliance doesn't benefit them. That's one major problem for the U.S. The other is that China's claims in the South China Sea to waters 1,000 miles from its shore are so contrary to international law that they would undo the entire structure, right? This idea that China's not bound by any rules can't survive. Or if it were to be accepted, the whole international rules-based order could not survive. Because if the rules don't apply to China, then eventually they won't apply to anybody. Both of those things are unacceptable to the United States.
Sir Poling, thank you very much for sharing your time with us here and at home at GMA Regional TV.
Thank you so much, Jandy.